Back in the early 2010s, all the chatter in the wake of Skyward Sword was about how worn out the Zelda formula had gotten, and how the series was starting to feel like a relic in the gaming landscape. In all fairness, Skyward Sword's most direct comparisons after its release in late 2011 were probably Skyrim and Dark Souls. Games with expansive settings, nonlinear worlds, voice acting, and the kind of scope that one of Nintendo's flagship series should have been striving for if it were to keep up with the ever evolving industry. Not just were those comparisons to its contemporaries unflattering, but Skyward Sword was also seen by many as a step back even from 2006's Twilight Princess, which itself had already endured criticisms of stagnation lobbed its way upon release. Anyone else remember how much flame GameSpot took for being the only major reviewer that dared to score the game so low as a 7.5? Yeah, Tom McShay's probably feeling pretty vindicated these days. So it's hard to blame Nintendo for taking Breath of the Wild in a very different direction following a decade of being the old dog in the room. The formula established in A Link to the Past was largely discarded, and the team famously returned to the relative purity of the original NES game as inspiration going forward. It was a gamble, but one that obviously paid off with most respects in Breath of the Wild, but I'm sure I speak for more than just myself when I say that the Divine Beasts failed to live up to the dungeon crawling that the series had come to be known for, and the shrines were in no way going to bridge the gap. With Tears of the Kingdom right around the corner, it's too soon to say on whether the Zelda team will try to improve on whatever analog of the Divine Beasts exists in Tears. But I'm not holding my breath, as Nintendo rarely Nintendoes what you think you want them to Nintendo. And now it's been a long time since A Link Between Worlds. I'm craving my fix for classic, but not that classic, but still pretty retro at this point, Zelda goodness. That's right, I didn't forget about A Link Between Worlds. A Link Between Worlds now sits in an odd pocket of history between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, where it had begun to dabble with means of reinvigorating the Zelda formula, such as letting you rent items from Mr. Ravioli rather than having to unlock them in the dungeons. While it was a perfectly enjoyable game, it didn't go far enough in its efforts, and so it's been relegated to the hauntological imagined futures of the 3DS's dead development dreams, buried right next to Kid Icarus Uprising and presumably every single game that made any unique use of the Wii U's tablet. So, anyways, I'm left with two questions I want answered. How do I get my Zelda fix? And while we're at it, has anyone actually succeeded in revitalizing the Zelda formula with fresh ideas? Or in other words, who has Nintendo done what Nintendo didn't? Ugh, God. Did I write that? I guess we need to establish what a Zelda-like even entails before we can dive that much into who else has done it. I've sort of come to see it as a game consisting of two major parts. First is an overworld focused on exploration, where the bulk of the story and character interactions take place. Second is the dungeon crawling that emphasizes smaller scale gameplay scenarios and an escalating series of challenges of combat, puzzle solving, navigation, so on, while also frequently providing a unique item that distinguishes each specific dungeon and which may then have an impact on the overworld's exploration. So it shares a lot in common with other strains of action-adventure, dungeon crawlers, and Metroidvanias and the like, but I think the specificity and the distinction of each individual dungeon scenario is of particular import. Does my own definition mean that Psychonauts is practically a Zelda-like? I guess kind of, so I clearly haven't given a perfect definition of what a Zelda-like should be. But you know what, this will suffice for the sake of the video, which I promise will eventually be about Unsighted. And as much as I want to point to a lack of puzzle solving as the key component that disqualifies Psychonauts, the dirty secret about Zelda's puzzles is they really aren't that involving. And so it's hard to label them as essential to the experience, but more on that in a bit. A recent tweet from Super Bunny Hop raised the question of why none of Zelda's imitators over the years have managed to surpass their inspiration. It's not like Metroidvanias, where there are several reasonable arguments for games that may have surpassed the classics. But why not Zelda? Many have tried to imitate the series, but not as many as you'd think, and few ever seem to set their ambitions so lofty as to try to surpass Zelda's heights. From larger studios, there's arguably Rare's Star Fox Adventures and Ubisoft's Beyond Good and Evil. They didn't get quite as much content as the mainline Zeldas usually did back then, but in exchange, you got voice acting, more prominent story, and other welcome additions like vehicle sections, stealth. Yeah, yeah. There was also, Okami and the first Darksiders? I mean, I remember the first Darksiders being fine, but kind of derivative between Zelda and God of War without really offering much in the way of fresh ideas. Though it has been at least a decade since I played it. As for Okami, while its scale and aesthetic were ambitious, I never really felt that its gameplay quite lived up to the presentation. Also, your sidekicks sucked even harder than Navi. That might be too harsh. The last major one I can think of, by my definition, is maybe Arkham City. In which case, yeah, that game's pretty damn good. But let's not get into the nuances of that claim, as I'm worried the resulting tangent would derail the focus of this video even worse off than it already is. So, then we've got to look to the indie scene. One of the earlier Zelda clones I can think of is Blossom Tales. It's a cute little game, but its puzzles get really samey by the end of its 8-ish hours. I haven't played the sequel, maybe it got more ambitious than the first, but I don't know. Games like Hyper Light Drifter and Death's Door take clear inspiration, but it's apparent they weren't interested in trying to one-up Zelda's puzzles. So they mostly didn't bother, and instead focused on their own charming aesthetics and on topping an aspect of Zelda they knew they could beat: the combat. It worked out pretty well for them, especially Hyper Light Drifter, and Death's Door managed to get an intriguing set of post-game quests that Zelda could have benefited from long ago. Just don't try to do the Umbrella-only playthrough. That kind of turns the whole thing into a joyless slog. Then you got something like Tunic, and, well, despite its appearance, it takes far more influence from Fez than it does Zelda once it comes down to the heart of the gameplay. There's also Blue Fire, which actually takes the risk of being in full 3D, and, well, I didn't personally get enough out of it to finish it, but look, that's not a slight on the game, I just wasn't hooked. Don't talk to me about crosscode, you don't want me to start that rant. I was saying earlier that the presence of puzzles wasn't essential to defining a Zelda-like, partly because most Zelda puzzles are, frankly, trivial to solve. What makes them notable, however, is that they provide a frequent and easily tweakable source of variety between dungeons. To take this thought further, I'd argue that the series' real strength comes from the illusion of complexity, notably in the form of this kind of variety. A lot of the game's puzzles do ultimately come down to pushing a block on a switch, or hitting a target with a projectile, or slaying some monsters. It's the presentation that's key. The Zelda games, especially the 3D ones, have a lot of time and resources poured into them. The payout is, again, variety. Variety of environment, of scenario, of mechanics, of gameplay. Zoom in too much on any of the games with a microscope, and you'll start to see the shallowness of any of its component pieces, be it the platforming, navigation, combat, side questing, exploration, puzzle solving. It's in how Nintendo weaves them together and paces them out where they begin to shine. And the different dungeon themes are a deft enough illusion to prevent the player from getting bogged down in over-analyzation. Until they start reusing the forest, volcano, water temple setup too many times, of course. Then you wind up with a Skyward Sword backlash situation on your hands. This is why the Prodigal and Anodyne games excel, in my opinion. They know how to work within their limits to provide the best overall experience, playing to their strengths on the micro scale instead of replicating the entirety of a Zelda game's much higher budgeted scope. Prodigal is super small scale on the surface, with its Game Boy aesthetic and a mere 3-item inventory, but it exercises the theming of each dungeon to a different type of puzzle scenario and then mines them for all that they're worth. That variety and its heavy emphasis on lore and NPC interactions, a la a dating sim, that extends well into the post-game, and you have an indie Zelda-like that is often more fun than its handheld progenitors. Then you've got the Anodyne games, which have no dungeon items at all. The first one gradually deconstructs its whole setting around you, and the second one delves deep into abstract and emotional themes as you shrink down into the bodies of NPCs to clean out all the dust they got in there. They're often minimalistic in their presentations, but much like Prodigal, they capitalize on varying up scenarios to keep you always excited for what new world you'll stumble into next. Anodyne 2 in particular I find to be an incredible and haunting experience, which maybe I'll be able to speak on more someday. Until then, check out NitroRad's channel for a couple of really good videos on the games if they sound interesting to you. But we've beaten around the bush enough. For all the games the Zelda series has inspired, few ever surpass its overall presentation. Some great indies in particular are out there, but they tend to be great by creating their own experiences, either through stellar writing or features otherwise outside the purview of the traditional Zelda formula. Enter Unsighted. You play as Alma. Oh god, no, not that one. An amnesiac android automaton in the ruined city of Arcadia. Years ago, a meteor struck the planet and granted all automatons sentience through the spread of its compositional material, anima. A war eventually broke out between humans and machines, which humanity appears largely to have lost. However, the humans recently succeeded in sealing off the meteor, restricting anima from continuing to spread into the surrounding Arcadia. Without a steady source of anima, machines are one by one losing their sentience, or, as the automatons say, are going unsighted. And I have bad news about what's going to happen to Granny Teresa. As Alma, your goal is to gather 5 hidden shards of meteor from 5 powerful Unsighted in order to forge a weapon that will let you penetrate humanity's defenses, restore the flow of anima to the surviving automatons, and free your girlfriend before the humans can perform any more weird evil experiments on her. So, from the premise, you know you'll be delving into 5 Zelda-like dungeons, each with their own setting, key item, and boss. From how I've structured this video so far, you may have already reasonably deduced that these can be completed in any order. There's even an achievement specifically for completing them in reverse order to how the game recommends. Really, the only freedom you don't have in approaching your goals is that you have to do all 5 dungeon bosses before you can enter the final zone. It's a bit of a bummer that you can't rush right to Calamity Ganon, given everything else, but what are you gonna do? Part of the catch here is that dungeons aren't roughly equal in difficulty the way, say, A Link Between Worlds did during its Dark World portion. No, these are very much ordered according to their respective difficulties on an intentional path. What's more, it won't even be clear when you're starting out how it's even possible to do the dungeons out of order without acquiring each subsequent special item first. And this is where the genius of Unsighted begins. Everything has a catch. Everything has a, wait, I can do that? Type moment. For the sake of avoiding spoilers, I'll hold back on showing anything specific, but suffice to say that if you liked this moment from Celeste, then you're going to find something to love in this game because it is full of those kinds of moments. Well, maybe not as extreme as that one. I'll finish Farewell one of these days, man. One of Unsighted's big shakeups to the formula is the dissolution of the hard separation between dungeon and overworld. Each dungeon is directly incorporated into navigating the overworld, with one consequence being that there isn't a single dungeon you have to enter through the front door. Outside the final dungeon, of course. There was an entire mini-boss that I didn't even realize was in the game during my first playthrough. I found an alternate route through its dungeon by exercising a little creativity and never had to cross paths with the thing. Hell, there isn't a single dungeon you need to get the exact version of its key item from in order to complete it. Even if you can't find an alternative solution, any major item can be crafted at a workbench, along with any number of weapons and gear, so long as you input the proper materials and the correct recipe. Sure, you have a snowball's chance in hell of blindly guessing one of those recipes without having the respective blueprint of whatever you're trying to craft first, but you don't technically need those blueprints to make anything. The game features an entire mode based off this feature, In addition to a conventional New Game Plus, Unsighted features something called New Game Extra after beating the final boss. You don't carry anything over, it's a fresh save file. However, you have immediate access to recipes for crafting every major item in the game, without needing to waste time memorizing them from your original file to use like the dirty little cheater you are. Your arsenal is a conventional selection of boomerang, explosives, hook shots, etc., with their own little twists, as mentioned previously, as well as occasional elemental touches of fire and ice and lightning. They even included the Twilight Princess spinner, but not shitty. For melee weapons, you can choose between a straightforward selection of swords and axes, axes being substantially slower and more stamina consuming, but with higher damage as a trade-off. There's also about a dozen guns available to round out your ranged options, including pistols, a machine gun, a shotgun, flamethrower, grenade launchers, and all of these are able to be upgraded at a blacksmith. Combat feels tightly satisfying. It's built primarily around stamina management and parrying, which is quickly becoming a staple of this channel. One of my few complaints is how enemies that begin winding up an attack behind an environmental object lose their usual visual cue of turning red to indicate an attack is coming, but otherwise it's a rewarding and fast-paced system that gets all the essentials right. Even your spin attack and jump have iframes, guns have an active reload mechanic a la Gears of War to speed up their downtime if performed correctly. There's enough enemy variety to prevent repetitive encounters from piling up. There's passive buffs from chips and cogs to account for. Enemies stay dead until you use a teleport station. You can deflect bullets and attacks with your melee. Perfect parries refill your stamina. Overall, it can be punishing as you're learning it, and you'll drop half your carried currency when you die, but you'll have the chance to retrieve your bloodstain like a lot of other action games currently do. You can also find and rescue any of 5 dogs to fight alongside you. As snappy as the combat can be, I do feel like the bosses could have been more interesting challenges. It can be pretty easy to completely trivialize the encounters once you've gotten good at parrying, and with the proper chips set up, you can output absolutely obscene bursts of damage. Which, yeah, that can be part of the appeal, but I'd like to feel a little bit more like I earned it rather than just applying the same basic strategy to each boss. They each also fall back on summoning mooks to try to extend the fight, which isn't exactly exciting the 7th time in a row you've seen it. I mean, sure, I'm glad these aren't just expose the eyeball, rinse and repeat encounters, but merely being better than the most generic Zelda fights isn't setting your sights very high. It's a gripe that stands out a bit more if you play the boss rush mode and very rapidly get a feel for how samey the fights get when done back to back. Maybe this gets curtailed somewhat in the unlockable robot apocalypse difficulty, but I don't know, I haven't done a playthrough of that yet. I do think your limited interactions with the NPCs are a missed opportunity in Unsighted. The framework for something more engaging exists, but it never gets properly fleshed out with the kinds of side quests or dialogue or choices that make such interactions meaningful. Most of the NPCs you talk to end up just as one kind of shopkeeper or another, and largely fail to establish memorable personalities for themselves. And to state the obvious, yeah, this game's cast primarily consists of gay and colored people, but, as robots. If you have a problem with that, or feel a compulsion to point out that that somehow makes the game bad and woke, I don't care. Here's an exercise for you. Try to write down an objective definition of what the word woke means to you, then while reading it back to yourself, ask how it's a bad thing in any feasible way, and then consider that your attitude about the fall of Western civilization is the real reason why you have a hard time making friends. At least friends who don't have tradcath anime profile pics. Look, I was raised Catholic, and believe me when I say that even we don't want you. What was I saying? Right. Anyways, the story mechanic of automatons losing their sentience comes into play here. Unsighted tracks in-game days across a day-night cycle, and every character you speak with has an internal clock always ticking down, yourself included. You'd think this would apply a lot of pressure on the player in some way, but it really doesn't. Most characters have generous timers, and the loss of one shopkeeper or another really doesn't have much impact when everything in the game you need can be found or crafted. What's more, one of the most prominent rewards you'll come across for exploration is meteor dust. Give this anima rich substance to any NPC and it extends their lifespan by another in game day. Give them a couple more to earn discounts, and finally some kind of reward at 3 offerings. This can be a unique weapon, a convenient tool that lets you rearrange your chips anywhere, and so on. Or, if you want to be selfish, you can give 3 dust at a time to a certain NPC to increase the number of rechargeable Estus syringes you can carry. Or maybe you'll take so long to save the day that you'll have to use some on yourself to keep Alma's clock ticking. So you can see how this meteor dust system is primed for engaging the player in tough choices about who you most want or need to save based on limited resources that are always counting down. But again, this setup never gets capitalized on, because not only are the time limits extremely forgiving for the abundance of dust available, there also really aren't any NPCs I felt particularly attached to or compelled into saving anyways. Except for my fairy buddy. I liked her. I think my first playthrough was something like 15 in-game days to beat 100%, maybe 10 to 12 real-world hours. But I didn't have that save backed up, and that was over a year ago, so I can't say for certain. Either way, it's long enough that you may find yourself letting an NPC or 3 go unsighted, but, not before you've had plenty of time to squeeze every worthwhile resource out of them consequence-free. If you still don't like the idea of time-based pressure, no worries, as you can turn off the countdown system at any time in the options, which is a nice little concession regardless of how minimally stressful I personally found the implementation to be. Now, wasn't I forgetting something? Oh. Oops. Sorry, Granny. Aside from a missed opportunity here and there, and also the lack of an auto sort and quick scroll in the menus, I find it very difficult to fault much in Unsighted, especially when the story clearly wasn't as much a focus as the gameplay. In my opinion, it's a trade-off that was worth it, because Unsighted's gameplay absolutely excels against its compatriots. It's the first game in a long time to actually crack open the restrictive Zelda-like formula, play with its innards in ways that revolve entirely around gameplay and structure, without having to de-emphasize dungeon crawling out of existence to do so. It makes me excited to see the future of this kind of game, and it serves as a good reminder that there's room for innovation without the extremes of complete deconstruction of the medium. Who knows if Zelda itself will ever return to this form, but I'm glad there's still pioneers out there in the indie sphere who are trying to accomplish what the big guy often overlooks. But maybe I'll eat my words soon here, now that Tears of the Kingdom is almost out. Thanks for watching.